when I was doing the research for 6 Days in September, I realized that I had come up with hundreds of pages of notes, and that these were telling a story that I was not finding in the established or published histories of the war, especially the histories of Lee's army. So I decided I was going to publish a nonfiction book as well, and that was this one called Their Maryland. It's the Army of Northern Virginia from the Potomac crossing to Sharpsburg in 1862. And you can, if you're interested, I wrote both nonfiction and fiction because it's kind of a challenge to write both of them. I mean, they're very different styles. But also the material in the last two chapters in this book is the material that made up 6 Days in September, but written as history. So I've encountered people in all my speaking and traveling and things who they do not like to read fiction. It doesn't matter how accurate it is, they will not read it. And then I've encountered people who will not read history because they don't like footnotes. So I figured I'm going to get both of you. And so that's what this is. So the material that I'll be presenting today is a new perspective on the Maryland campaign. I'll be mixing in some comments about the Pennsylvania campaign of 1863 as well. And what I want to do is I want to make it perfectly clear how Lee's first campaign outside of Virginia, which is often portrayed as the Army of Northern Virginia's first invasion of the North, differed from the campaign that really took his army north of the Potomac River in June of 1863. So, as I mentioned, the material, now if I can get this thing forward, please go forward. There we go. As I mentioned, the material I'll be presenting comes from essays or chapters number 1 and number 6 of Their Maryland, the book I just showed you, and also an essay that I published in a magazine called North and South in June of 2022. And that's called Lee's Beaver Creek Plan, the battle that he never had a chance to fight and why that's important, which I'm sure that no one here has heard of the place Beaver Creek in Maryland. Has anyone heard of that place? So I'm right, good. Except maybe you might have heard it if you go past, if you go up Alt 40 and you see the sign. That's really about it. So anyway, I completed it as the book was going into print, and I didn't have a chance to incorporate it into the book itself. So let me move forward here. So General Robert E. Lee found himself in a weird position or an opposition at the beginning of September of 1862. And having driven George McClellan's Army of the Potomac away from the gates of Richmond in June, and then having routed John Pope's Federal Army of Virginia at the Battle of Second Manassas or Bull Run at the end of August, General Lee found himself with no opponent left to fight. As Lee later recounted of this moment, the armies of Generals McClellan and Pope had now been brought back to the point from which they had set out on the campaigns of spring and summer. The objects of those campaigns had been frustrated, and the war that was thus transferred from the interior to the frontier of Virginia, he's talking about, of course, and the supplies of rich and productive districts made accessible to our army. Unable to pursue the enemy into the fortifications of Washington, D.C., Lee elected on September 2nd to push his army north into Maryland. This operation unfolded quickly, with Lee marching his troops to the vicinity of Leesburg in Loudoun County here on September 3rd. And then one day later, the first men of his army to cross the Potomac River into Maryland did so at Cheeks Ford under the command of Daniel Harvey Hill. So Lee intended to pursue multiple objectives at this point in his campaign. First, as he informed the Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, by dispatch on September 3rd, and I quote, "The present seems to me the most propitious time since the commencement of the war for the Confederate Army to enter Maryland," unquote, due to both the disorganization and demoralization of the enemy. In addition, Lee also wrote to Davis, and I quote again, "If it is ever desired to give material aid to Maryland and to afford her an opportunity of throwing off the oppression to which she is now subject, this would seem most favorable," unquote. And I'll return to this subject in more detail soon. He added one day later, so on September 4th, "Should the results of the expedition justify it, I propose to enter Pennsylvania, unless you should deem it unadvisable upon political or other grounds," indicating that Lee initially entertained designs on Pennsylvania much as he would the following summer. Scholars of the campaign have fixated on this mention of Pennsylvania ever since, but the question is what Lee meant by the conditional phrase at the beginning of that statement. Should the results of the expedition justify it? As you'll see later in this presentation, I believe Lee provided an answer to this question only a short time later. So also in preparation for the campaign, Lee designed a plan to shift his army of supply west into the Shenandoah Valley from the east of the Blue Ridge Mountains, which is where his army had entered Maryland. Expressing this in writing to Davis on September 5th, Lee noted, quote, "The road to Richmond through Warrenton has been abandoned as far back as Culpeper Courthouse, and all trains are directed to proceed by way of Luray and Front Royal from Culpeper Courthouse to Winchester, which will be my depot." Lee anticipated that the Federals, upon learning that his army had traversed the Potomac, would abandon the garrisons at Martinsburg and Harper's Ferry and leave the road cleared for his supplies all the way to the river and from there to Hagerstown. These preparations would prove useful if Lee decided to push his army farther north, or if he decided to fight it out in Maryland. Whichever scenario eventually developed, Lee felt certain that the weakened condition of the enemy would give him enough time to operate on the northern frontier, as he put it, until winter arrived. If the Federals declined to give battle while his army was in Maryland, Lee hoped to at least annoy and harass them as the opportunity presented itself. So as I've already noted, General Lee often referred to his campaign as an expedition. The word appeared twice in his September 4th letter to Davis, and Lee used it again in his correspondence after the campaign had come to its disappointing end. To be sure, Lee used the word expedition in a number of contexts throughout the war. So in 1862, for example, October of 1862, for example, he referred to Jeb Stuart's raid into Pennsylvania as an expedition. So we can assume that he meant also by its use that he was using it as with the same in the same term as or meaning as operation. However, there's also an element of discovery to it, and so it's legitimate to ask what Lee might have hoped to discover in Maryland once his army had entered the state. Okay. So what I would argue is that the thing Lee most hoped to discover was the strength of secessionist sentiment in Maryland. He made this clear to Davis in the first letter I quoted, and he also made it clear in multiple mentions of it during the campaign and after it had ended. I've crowded those comments onto this slide. They include statements dictated by Lee himself. So remember, at this time, both of his hands are bandaged. He's had a fall on August 31st. His horse had pulled him down during a rainstorm in the mud, and when he fell, he broke bones in his right wrist, and he had sprained his left wrist. So he can't write, and he can't even dress himself at this point in time. So he walks around with his right arm in a sling and his left hand free. So taken together, these quotes provide a body of evidence demonstrating that encouraging Maryland's secession from the Union was among Lee's primary objectives when crossing the Potomac River in September of 1862. Indeed, I would argue that it is Lee's, he would sought to achieve both a political objective, so Maryland's secession, and a military objective, that being the decisive defeat of the Federal Army in the East at the same time. Following his initial statement to Davis on September 3rd about helping Maryland to throw off the oppression to which she is now subject, Lee repeated this idea on September 5th. Then 2 days later, on September 7th, he complained to Davis about the problem of straggling by Confederate troops. Otherwise known as leaving the ranks without permission, straggling had presented a serious problem in Virginia, but in Maryland, Lee considered it to be a potentially crippling tendency because his army was in a state, and I'm quoting here, in a state whose citizens it is our purpose to conciliate and bring with us. Every outrage upon their feelings and property should be checked, he added. So then one day after this, on September 8th, Lee issued his proclamation to the people of Maryland. Composed by Major Charles Marshall, a native Marylander and Lee's aide-de-camp, the proclamation struck a note intended to hearten every secessionist in the state. The fact that Lee signed off on this document indicates that he fully agreed with the sentiments it expressed. Declaring that our army is prepared to assist you with the power of its arms in regaining the rights of which you have been despoiled, the proclamation noted, this, citizens of Maryland, is our mission. So we need look no further than this statement to understand exactly what Lee had hoped to achieve in the state, especially because he wrote basically the same thing on multiple occasions. In addition, it's around this time that Lee uttered a comment which made it into the pages of the Philadelphia Inquirer of all places, stating, and I quote, "We have come now to redeem our pledge to the people of this state. We extend the olive branch to them, and should they accept it, we shall welcome and protect them with the assurance that the next battleground will be in Pennsylvania. But should they not come forward after having been assured of that their property would be unmolested and every guarantee given that the Southern Army should remain on Maryland soil for the maintenance of their sacred rights, then the battleground must hereafter be in Maryland." Lee probably arranged to have this statement planted in the Inquirer, and I believe this because it was intended to inform secessionists in Baltimore area about his plans. I also believe it's authentic because it's consistent with his other statements and because it accurately describes events as they unfolded during the campaign. And then finally, I'd like us to consider a comment that Lee wrote in his post-campaign report, composed in August of 1863, so after the defeat at Gettysburg. Lee wrote, "It was hoped that military success," and that's something I think we can safely define as victory, might afford us to aid the citizens of Maryland in any efforts they might be disposed of to recover their liberties. Given the sentiments expressed in these documents, I think the evidence is clear and compelling that Lee led his army into Maryland to encourage the state's secession from the Union. I would argue that, in fact, that from the beginning of the campaign to his report in August 1863, he gave encouraging secession in Maryland as the reason for his campaign more often than any other rationale, including the feeding and provisioning of his army. And yet, despite all of the evidence for this, histories of the campaign ignore that this was Lee's goal. So why might that be? So I would suggest there are multiple reasons why so little attention has been paid to General Lee's secessionist ambitions. In the first place, I think many of the post-war opinions offered by former Confederates during the era when the lost cause ideology was being constructed have been accepted at face value. Take, for example, in this context, something the late historian Joseph Harsh has called Lee's strategic dilemma. So even casual readers of Civil War history have probably encountered this. It states in a nutshell that Lee's army was too weak to be able to attack Washington, D.C., but there was no food and fodder where it was, so it couldn't stay where it was. It couldn't move west because it would open the route to Richmond down south. It couldn't move south because Lee's army had fought its way all the way from Richmond up to Manassas in northern Virginia, and that it would be demoralizing for the army to have shed so much blood for no reason. So that's basically the dilemma as it's in a nutshell. So that left him with three options: to move into Maryland, move west in the Shenandoah Valley, or move south. But none of these options were practical. This tale originated with the aforementioned Charles Marshall, who in 1876 wrote a letter and said that General Lee had no choice but to move his army into Maryland. Not only could the state provide food for his men marching north, it would also draw the enemy out of Virginia, providing with a reprieve for more than a year of wartime devastation. So after Marshall's papers become available in 1927, an author named Douglas Southall Freeman, who won a Pulitzer Prize for a 4-volume biography of Lee, picked up on the scenario, and historians have really been repeating it uncritically ever since. There is, however, a problem. Other than mentioning that he hoped to take the war out of Virginia for the harvest season, General Lee never stated anywhere that he faced such a dilemma as described by Marshall. In point of fact, Lee wrote to Jefferson Davis on September 5th that his design to enter Maryland could not be carried out. And I quote, "It is my intention to take a position around Warrenton, which is located about 15 miles southwest of Manassas, and to maintain his army there." More importantly, from the beginning of September, Lee expressed a desire to get at the enemy, stating that he did not want the fall season to pass without striking another blow. To quote Lee's report on this subject, he stated, "To prolong a state of affairs in every way desirable and not to permit the season for active operations to pass without endeavoring to inflict further injury upon the enemy, the best course appeared to be to transfer the army into Maryland." He then confirmed in February 1868, stating to Edward C. Gordon, professor at Washington College in Lexington, that he had entered Maryland to give battle, and to William Allen at the same time that he had wanted to turn the Federals out of DC and their DC fortifications so he could get to them. I believe Marshall's description of Lee's post-second Manassas situation, therefore, is deliberately deceptive, and historians have bought into it for nearly 100 years. Marshall framed the invasion of Maryland as a purely defensive operation and as the only choice available to General Lee at the time. It follows then that because it was defensive in nature and could not be avoided, Lee could never have entertained notions of wanting to foment rebellion in Maryland or of entering the state as an act of aggression. The truth is, however, that Lee's Maryland operation was intended to do and be exactly those things. It was intended to bring Maryland into the Confederate fold, and it was to be an offensive that created an opportunity to crush the Federal Army in a decisive battle north of the Potomac. Moving to reason number two, I think accurate memory of the period has been lost. And that contributes to the notion that because Maryland never seceded, Lee's operation in the state could never have been intended to achieve that outcome. Most people in the state did support remaining in the Union, but secessionist sentiment was strong enough to be a serious concern for Lincoln's government. An editorial in the New York Herald from August 26, 1862 makes this apparent. Quoting this article now, the condition of affairs in Maryland is not satisfactory to loyal Union men. It is well known that the rebels there are openly organized in every county in the state, and there is reason to believe they are fully prepared with arms and only wait an opportunity to raise the black flag of rebellion, unquote. Now, I think that concerns such as these forced the Lincoln administration to suspend constitutional liberties in the state, to implement martial law, and to keep thousands of troops stationed in and around Baltimore. These are hardly the acts of a government that's confident that Maryland can be trusted to remain loyally in the Union, particularly with a victorious Confederate army operating on its soil. And yet these facts are generally not taken into account in histories of the Maryland campaign. I think instead an unfortunate tendency has developed toward ex post facto thinking, with generations of scholars unwilling to consider the fear and anxiety in Northern circles that attended Lee's Cross Potomac March. Reason number 3 is really straightforward enough. Ever since he ran for president in 1864, George McClellan's performance in Maryland has occupied the attention of most historians. Accused of advancing at a slow pace, which helped rebel forces capture Harper's Ferry, of dawdling 18 hours after he received key information about Lee's army in the form of the lost orders, and of not destroying Lee's army at Antietam when he should have, McClellan has been the focus point of most Maryland campaign studies. Even the late Professor Harsh, I've mentioned before, the author of what many consider to be the definitive history of Lee's campaign, was a McClellan scholar who wrote his doctoral thesis on the general. So I believe that as a result of the focus on McClellan, that the Maryland campaign has been poorly understood, especially the Confederate side of the story. Reason number 4 brings us to comparisons between Maryland and the Pennsylvania campaigns. So the Maryland campaign is typically framed as a kind of dry run for Lee's northern offensive in the summer of 1863, with his motives for that latter campaign being assigned to him also in 1862. So the Maryland campaign is therefore often described as Lee's first invasion of the North, with a general intent on making it into Pennsylvania, but just not quite getting there on his first attempt. So I'd like to discuss a few reasons why I think this interpretation of events is fraught with problems. The first concerns the notion of Maryland as northern. So while the state didn't secede, and it did provide thousands of troops for the Union Army, it also contained a large secessionist minority, and it provided thousands of troops for General Lee's army. Moreover, it's located south of the Mason-Dixon line and was home to a significant slaveholding population, particularly on the Eastern Shore. So I'd contend, therefore, that Maryland in September of 1862 is a border South state with strong Unionist tendencies. And even recent scholarship has revealed that large pockets of Unionism existed throughout the Confederacy, including in this area and up and down the Shenandoah Valley. I think if you've ever seen the movie Free State of Jones with Matthew McConaughey, you can see how this idea of unionism in the South has actually penetrated into popular culture in the last 10 years, I guess. But yet only in Maryland's case is unionism conflated with being Northern. You don't hear about it for Kentucky. You don't hear about it for Missouri. You don't hear about it for Delaware. You only hear about it for Maryland. So I would submit that no other northern state required federal government to keep it under martial law and occupied by thousands of troops in order to ensure that it stayed in the Union. Historically and culturally, Maryland was at the time a southern border state caught in the unfortunate position of being situated between the two warring factions of the country. This has been forgotten when it comes to the military history of the war, with the result that the campaign in Maryland is all too often called Lee's first invasion of the North. It was actually a very different kind of operation, with the objective of bringing into the Confederacy a southern state that Lee, his army, and many across the South, rightly or wrongly, believed had been kept in the Union by force. Indeed, as I have shown, I hope, General Lee admitted repeatedly that he took his army into Maryland precisely to pry it out of the Union, which is something that no one would accuse him of trying to do with Pennsylvania in the summer of 1863. Secessionist Southerners also played a part in creating the perception of Maryland as a northern state after the failure of the campaign. Bitterness about the fact that Marylanders did not rebel when they were given the chance caused them to disavow the state as authentically Southern. I would argue, however, that this position wasn't clear in September of 1862, but rather it evolved during the war, and it's clear in differences between how rebel troops treated Marylanders during Lee's campaign, and then when Jubal Early entered the state 2 years later with the Valley Army in July of 1864. So during Lee's 2 weeks in Maryland, their rebel troops generally behaved well. Discipline broke down toward the end of the campaign as supply lines failed and Lee's men had to forage among the people of Sharpsburg out of necessity. But the depredations carried out at this stage of the campaign contrast strongly with reports elsewhere where rebel troops heeded orders to pay for what they took or to not take anything at all if they could help it. Contrast this with the rough handling of Maryland's people during Jubal Early's march through the state 2 years later. With Maryland then 6 months into the process of abolishing slavery, Early treated the people of Hagerstown, Middletown, and Frederick every bit as harshly as he did the people of South Central Pennsylvania in June of 1863. He levied ransom payments, requisitioned supplies, threatened to raise entire villages to the ground or communities to the ground if they did not pay. These acts make it clear that by the summer of 1864, the Confederate perception of Maryland had changed from thinking of the state as a sympathetic ally in the border South to an antagonistic state in the border North. The change of perspective is understandable, given what happened, and it's persisted until the end of the day, until the present day. But I would argue that it did not apply in September of 1862 when Lee's men celebrated entering Maryland in the hope that its people would rise up and join their cause. So this brings us to the Pennsylvania as the target of Lee's operation. Now, I'll describe in greater detail as we proceed that while Lee may have begun the Maryland campaign with an eye toward entering the Keystone State, he abandoned the idea almost immediately after he had reached Frederick. Then finally, there is a statement that Lee wrote to Davis on September 7th, which historians have frequently cited as proof the general never sought to stoke the flames of rebellion. Writing, and I've got it up here on the slide here, that notwithstanding individual expressions of kindness that have been given, the general sympathy and the success of the Confederate States, situated as Maryland is, I do not anticipate any general rising of the people on our behalf. So scholars have long focused on the second part of the comment. I would argue, however, that the most important part is the conditional phrase in the middle, situated as Maryland is. What exactly did Lee mean by this? So this slide illustrates the situation at the time. Sharing a long line with Unionist Pennsylvania, and occupied by thousands of federal troops, situated as they were, secessionists in Maryland dared not hope that they could rise up and take the state out of the Union. That is, unless the Army of Virginia could protect them or provide them with some protection. Lee expressed this evolution in his thinking in a campaign report, which I reported at the length of the slide. But I'll paraphrase what the general's tortured language. Gordon, read that yourself and tell me if you think you can figure out what he's saying, because the passive use of passive voice is terrible. And I think that's on purpose. So Lee wrote, the condition of Maryland under martial law and occupied by federal troops encouraged him to believe that the Lincoln government would retain all of its forces in the state to prevent the rebellion that he hoped the presence of his army would encourage. He appreciated the difficulties that surrounded Maryland's people and understood that they would not rise up unless his army proved that it could defend them. He thought it could do this by winning a victory in the state, giving secessionist forces proof that his army would spill blood in order to protect them from federal reprisals. So influenced by these considerations, he took his army from Frederick. So this language describes an important pivot point in Lee's understanding of the situation. He had entered the state assuming that the mere presence of his army would inspire, rebellion to break out in the state. But now we saw that the difficulties that faced them could only be overcome by his army winning a victory. Of course, he had already planned on fighting a battle to do exactly that. But the fact now that he openly conflated his military and political aims represented a significant change in his description of the situation. So it's therefore worth asking how this modification of his thinking came about. So on the day that he crossed the Potomac at White's Ford, General Lee attended a dinner in Frederick at the invitation of some influential local secessionists. And he attended it, I think, at this house, which is the parsonage for the First Presbyterian Church in downtown Frederick. And one of the things I like about living in this area is these places that you can go to, which are, they're historical, and you can go in there and just don't look in the windows because the parson still lives there. But you can visit these places, and that's great. So I think at this meal, some of the guests asked Lee why his army would come or had come. As he put it in a letter to Davis a week later, the citizens were embarrassed, meaning they didn't know, as to the intentions of the army. This situation prompted Lee to order Marshall to write the proclamation of Maryland's people on September 7th, which he then had published on September 8th. It's also during this period, around the 6th, that Lee made the statement, which showed up in the Philadelphia Inquirer on September 12th. And at the same time, he also learned about two developments on the military front. And this is really around the 8th of September. He heard from Jeb Stuart that the Federal Army had begun advancing toward Frederick, and that he learned from Colonel Elijah Veers White, the commander of a cavalry battalion here in Loudoun County, that the Federals had not abandoned Harper's Ferry as Lee had expected. So I believe it's at this point that Lee's political and military objectives became fully conflated. Convinced that he needed to win a victory in order to bring about Maryland's secession and eager to come to grips with the enemy, General Lee designed what he called Special Orders Number 191. Does everyone here know at least a little bit about the Confederate operation against Harper's Ferry, the multiple columns and Jackson approaching from the west? I just want to know how much detail I need to go into. So what I'll do is I'll concentrate on a few key points to illustrate the evolution of Lee's plan to confront the Federals in Washington County, Maryland. Special Orders Number 191 called for the rebel army to divide into 4 columns, and 3 of these would be under the command of Stonewall Jackson, with the objective of surrounding the Federal garrison in Harper's Ferry. Lee would command the 4th column himself, and it would include 8 brigades of General Longstreet's infantry, an independent infantry brigade under Nathan Shanks Evans, the infantry division of D.H. Hill, and the reserve artillery and the Army's immense baggage train. This column would march to the vicinity of Boonesboro, just west of South Mountain, and stop there to await the successful conclusion of Jackson's operation. On September 11th, however, Lee received word of 2 things: a large supply of flour in Hagerstown that his army desperately needed, and an enemy force approaching that place from the north. And the enemy force turned out to be a large number of militia troops that were gathered up by Governor Curtin in Pennsylvania and were being pushed south toward Chambersburg. It would have been a disaster had these men actually met Lee's army in battle. But it was enough to make sure that Lee changed his plans a little bit compared to how he had originally planned this operation. So Lee moved north to Hagerstown with part of his command, creating a 5th column. So I believe it's during this march north that Lee discovered the high ground behind Beaver Creek, located about 5 miles north of Boonesboro, and decided that he was going to use it as his defensive position in Western Maryland. With heights as high as 560 feet in some places, the heights are extremely steep on the right flank especially. That side of the ridgeline is also hemmed in by Antietam Creek. So ironically, if there had been a battle fought there, it may have been called Antietam because the creek is there too. And on the left side, they run almost all the way to South Mountain. I think the space between the end of the heights and South Mountain is probably only about a half a mile. Overall, the position is a very strong one to defend and difficult, although not impossible, to attack by the flank. So how do we know that Lee intended to fight the climactic battle of the war in this place? So in the first place, Lee wrote paragraph 9 of Special Orders Number 191 that the commands that he had detached to capture Harper's Ferry were to, quote, join the main body of the army at Boonesboro or Hagerstown once they had accomplished their objective. It is worth remembering that General Lee did not know exactly where he would make his stand when he dictated those orders. He only knew that he wanted to fight between Hagerstown and Boonesboro, and to quote his post-campaign report, that he hoped to, quote, induce the enemy to follow him west of South Mountain by threatening Pennsylvania. So please note the language that he used. Lee wrote by threatening Pennsylvania, not by entering Pennsylvania. In other words, during his stay near Frederick, General Lee abandoned the idea of entering Pennsylvania in favor of using it as bait, the idea of his army moving across the state line as bait for the Army of the Potomac. After Harper's Ferry had been taken, he intended to reassemble the detached parts of his army, call up stragglers and supplies from the Army's depot near Winchester, and crush the pursuing Federals. When he saw the heights behind Beaver Creek on September 11th, Lee decided that they would serve as the battlefield for his operation in the coming fight. By assuming a strong defensive position there, Lee thought that he could defeat the demoralized and disorganized enemy far from reinforcements and the protection of the DC fortifications. There would be no repeat of Second Manassas when Lee had watched his army rout Pope's army and then not be able to follow that up with by destroying the remnants, them allowing them to get safely into DC for protection. This time, if his army won, and General Lee didn't see any reason it shouldn't, there would be no refuge for the enemy. Stuart's cavalry could hunt them down and achieve the decisive Napoleonic-style victory that has so far eluded him in Virginia. He could then march at will on Baltimore or Washington, bring Maryland into the Confederacy, and hopefully end the war. So how do we know that Lee chose the heights behind Beaver Creek as his intended battleground? There are several pieces of evidence that make this clear. First, on the evening of September 13th, after he received messages from Judge Stewart and D.H. Hill warning him of a large federal force that had suddenly appeared at the eastern foot of South Mountain, Lee informed Lafayette McLaws in Pleasant Valley, General Longstreet will move down tomorrow and take position on Beaver Creek this side of Boonesboro. Second, according to Angela Kirkham Davis, a New Yorker living in Funkstown on the morning of September 14th, so the day that the Battle of South Mountain was occurring, Lee sent a messenger to warn her community that a fight was about to break out in their vicinity. So from the Confederate perspective, Funkstown's located about 4 miles in the rear of the Beaver Creek line. And so this is what she wrote. General Lee was still at his headquarters in Hagerstown, sent word to the citizens of Funkstown that there might be a battle in our midst at any time. The general promised that if possible, he would give us a few hours warning so that women, children, the sick and infirm could get out of town. Then on the afternoon of September 14th, so while the fighting is going on South Mountain, General William Nelson Pendleton, commander of the Army's Reserve Artillery, reported to Lee just outside of Boonesboro. And according to his report written only 10 days later, when I arrived and reported to you a short distance from the battlefield, you directed me to place in position on the heights of Beaver Creek the batteries of my command. This was accordingly done just before nightfall. In other words, even as the fighting was raging, General Lee remained intent on defending this Beaver Creek line. And then finally, there's substantial evidence to show that on the morning of September 14th, Lee did not come to D.H. Hill's relief as early as he should have. Histories of the campaign will tell you that Longstreet's troops departed from Hagerstown at daybreak, based on claims that both Longstreet and Lee made after the war. The truth is that Longstreet's command did not get underway until well after 8:00 a.m., when Lee heard cannon fire coming from the direction of South Mountain. This sound told him that D.H. Hill's command was under attack and in need of reinforcement. Longstreet subsequently made a severe force march that reduced his available combat strength by 50%. So why would General Lee keep Longstreet from marching at dawn unless we take into account his plan to fight at Beaver Creek? Stating after the war that he had never intended to defend the passes of South Mountain, but rather to draw the Federals west of the mountain for a clash in Washington County, he probably considered ordering Hill's division to pull back from the mountain to the Beaver Creek position for the battle that he wanted to fight there. In addition, there are multiple sources, including documents from Longstreet, Stewart, and Richard H. Anderson, that state that Lee anticipated Harper's Ferry would fall no later than September 14th, the day that McClellan attacked his army on attacked the South Mountain Gaps. I conclude from this that Lee held Longstreet back in anticipation that word of Harper's Ferry's fall would have arrived from Jackson any moment on the 14th. And when that message didn't arrive and the Federals attacked Hill, it forced Lee to send Longstreet to Hill's relief in order to keep McClellan from punching into Pleasant Valley and threatening the rear of Lafayette McLaws and Richard Anderson near Harper's Ferry. So as we know, defensive terrain, Lee's defense of the South Mountain Gaps failed, and this forced him to withdraw in the direction of Sharpsburg. The general even contemplated abandoning Maryland altogether until the long-awaited message from Jackson arrived at around 8:00 on the morning of September 15th. At that point, Lee decided to make his stand on the heights east of Sharpsburg, which looked remarkably similar to the heights behind Beaver Creek. And I think that's one reason why he chose them. By fighting there, he could still carry out his plan to fight in Maryland, albeit in modified form. He could confront the enemy west of South Mountain. He could fight in Maryland to support the state's secessionists, and he could defend a strong position located behind a watercourse. So wrapping off, I'd like to offer a few thoughts on the implications of viewing the campaign from this perspective. First, I believe my interpretation of the evidence provides an explanation why General Lee chose to fight at Sharpsburg. And that's long been missing because historians have forgotten or ignored Lee's political objectives. They've lacked a way to explain why he would have assumed so dangerous a position, with his back to the Potomac River and only one ford available to his army. Instead, historians have resorted to psychoanalyzing the general, arguing it was his disdain for George McClellan that caused him to fight. Or in the case of Joseph Harsh, to claim without evidence that Lee never sought to fight at Sharpsburg in the first place, and that McClellan forced him to do so. The second point I'd like to make is the truth is that Lee sought from the beginning of the campaign to bring Maryland into the Confederacy, as I've mentioned. But after September 8th, he believed he needed to fight in the state to prove his army would spill blood to protect the state's secessionist minority. Hoping to achieve a victory that would hearten them, he stood at Sharpsburg and had his army slug it out. The prize that Lee hoped to win in September 1862 was Maryland itself. Third, this interpretation of the events demonstrates the importance of the loss of Special Orders number 191 to the outcome of the campaign. Debate about this subject has long focused on McClellan and whether he dawdled or whether he, exactly what he did or didn't do with the plans. But by advancing more rapidly than Lee found convenient, and that's a sort of turn of phrase that Lee used, the Federal Army was advancing more than he found convenient. McClellan disrupted the trap that Lee had set for him at Beaver Creek. He also forced Lee to defend South Mountain, inflicting thousands of casualties as a result. McClellan's advance then, paired with the failure of Jackson to capture Harper's Ferry by September 14th, also forced Lee to reassemble his army more rapidly than he had planned. This required the detached commands to make forced marches that ended up decimating their ranks, such as the one that Longstreet's men made on September 14th. So McClellan's industry, informed by what he had learned in the Lost Orders, reduced Lee's available combat strength and forced him to fight at a less advantageous position than the Confederate commander originally chosen. The ad hoc position Lee took up at Sharpsburg left his army's left flank vulnerable to attack by a large enemy force. This is something less likely to have occurred at the Beaver Creek position, with space between the Confederate left and South Mountain being more confined. In short, I believe that General McClellan gave himself an opportunity to fight a weakened opponent on more favorable ground. The Federal commander did not know this, of course, but in hindsight, it becomes obvious. Lastly, I would argue that my interpretation of the Maryland campaign demonstrates just how different it was from the Pennsylvania campaign 1 year later. Lee entered Maryland, a state located in the border south and home to a large secessionist minority, to pry it from the Union. This was not the general's objective in the summer of 1863 when he crossed through Maryland to get into Pennsylvania. So in this sense, I believe it's accurate to conclude that General Lee invaded the North only once during the Civil War, and that was in the summer of 1863 and not in September of 1862. So with that, I thank you for your time. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Before we do that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. A little housekeeping. You notice when you walk in the door, we did not charge admission or ask you for a ticket. We like keeping these lectures free, which we've been doing for about 10 years now. But we do pass the hat and take up a collection. And that basket is coming up. Taylor? Lee. You can't.
Yeah, that's okay. I understand.
Yeah. So small baskets, big hearts. So be generous. And we will go ahead and take questions.
Great.
Yeah. That's
I don't. Okay, we'll find out. Yes, ma'am. Problem. Yeah.
And what was causing it? Wanting to get back to their lands to work farms and things, or what was?
So the Confederate Army in 1862 is largely made up of volunteers. There are some conscripts because in spring the government of Richmond had introduced the first Conscription Act. But most of them are volunteers, so they're there willingly. The problem is that at least 1/3 of Lee's army had, stand in front of the camera, at least 1/3 of Lee's army had no shoes, and they hadn't had shoes, or they had worn them out since moving from Richmond, and they had marched from Richmond all the way up to Northern Virginia and then into Maryland. When they got into Maryland, they encountered places like, or things like the macadamized National Road, which is gravel. And the gravel just tore people's feet up, and they also tore the shoes up that the remaining people had. So not having shoes is a big part of it. Another part is the complete breakdown of the Confederate logistical plan and logistics. There are records that show a tremendous amount of war material flowing out of Richmond north, but it didn't make it to the army. It made it to places like Warrenton, where it would collect, and then then the wagons would have to carry it farther from there, and they just couldn't handle the flow. And then also the armies are constantly moving, so it's difficult to keep up. So it's a combination of deprivation, starvation, sickness. There are people who literally legitimately, they're like, I've been fighting since, since Bull Run, first Bull Run, and I really don't want to do this anymore. So there are a variety of factors. And then I would also say that I have a sneaking suspicion that the fact that there were so many Marylanders who did not greet Confederate troops, that once they got up there, they went, this has been interesting, but I'm going home. So they left, and they walked back across the river and waited for the army to come back into Virginia. I haven't seen a lot of statements to that effect, but I'm almost positive that it must have happened, because there are a lot of statements, and I go into it, and I have an entire chapter in my book there, Maryland, on the interaction between Marylanders and Confederate troops, and it's quite interesting the different opinions that they saw and they encountered. Were there a question? Yes, sir.
The blurb on the Lovettsville Historical Society's website about this lecture mentioned, I think something else might have been going on with respect to orders for loss. I'm curious to hear you speak a little bit about that, and then we, after the war, see that issue.
So I'm not sure what the website says exactly.
Taken from your release.
It was taken from my release.
From your publisher's release.
Yeah. So that generally gets to the question of who lost them, where they were lost, that kind of thing. I have another book manuscript finished that I'm hoping to publish by this October called Calamity at Frederick. And it's based on a quote from Lee after the war, when he wrote to D.H. Hill, and he said, I considered the loss of the orders to be a calamity, and I haven't changed my opinion since then. The evidence that I've been able to find is that it was not D.H. Hill who lost them, or any member of his staff. So in chapter 3 of their Maryland, I show that the only evidence that shows where D.H. Hill's troops camped, his division camped, was about 4 miles southwest of the position where the orders were found. I haven't found any evidence that any Confederate unit from the 6th through the 9th camped where the orders were found. So where was it that they were found? That's also a contentious issue. And I think I've been able to identify where it is. I think it's around very close to South Frederick is really industrial. There are a lot of warehouses, and there's some factories there and things like that. And there were parts of it that were like that back then, but there were also large stretches of meadow. So I think that when the 27th Indiana was in its skirmish line moving up toward the city, there's mention by Sergeant Bloss, who's one of the 2 people who were there when the orders were found, said that we went as far as we could, and then we went to a meadow that was adjacent next to Frederick City and didn't encounter any of the enemy. And also we couldn't go any farther because there were columns converging on the right, which is the 9th Corps coming down the National Road. And you can see it from where I think the orders were found. And then the 2nd Corps, which is coming up Market Street into Frederick. So I think the corner of South Franklin Street and East South Street is the meadow, or that general area. And the only unit that I can put there with any kind of accuracy is Jeb Stewart's headquarters group, which was there on the night of September 11th. They retreated from Urbana and fell back to Frederick, and then they camped, as his chief of staff wrote, at the farm of an Irishman about a half a mile from Frederick. Well, that location is a half a mile from Frederick, and it's on the land owned by a man named Augustine D. O'Leary, who came from Ireland when he was 15. And by the time in 1830, and by the time that the war came, he owned property in excess of $100,000 worth of land. And that is a significant amount of money, of course, when we're talking about, gold specie is really what people use. They don't use just paper dollars necessarily. So Jeb Stewart was in the location the day before the orders were the day before the orders were found. The orders were also found the day after there was a downpour, significant downpour, but they show no signs of water damage. But yet they were found in grass, just laying there in the grass. So that tells me that they weren't dropped until after the downpour. So probably on the morning of September 12th, because that's when Stewart's command was pushed out of Frederick by the Ninth Corps Cavalry. So that raises yet another question. Why is Jeb Stewart carrying a copy of orders addressed to D.H. Hill? And I think that that's because the orders were lying about as extra copies, because D.H. Hill said for his entire life, and you can still find these, you can go online and there's a scan of them. I have a copy of the orders that were sent to me by Stonewall Jackson because his command was technically still under the command of Jackson at that time. It was detached on the morning of September 10th to go on this operation. So with all the other orders going out, there was a copy that was left, which was made at headquarters, that never was sent out because someone probably from Jackson's headquarters said, "Hey, we don't need you to send this. We sent a copy to Hill." And so the extra copy was made by a member of the headquarters staff from the orders to D.H. Hill and just given to Jeb Stewart. That's what I think happened. But that's again circumstantial evidence for the most part. Yeah, sure. Yes, ma'am. Oh, when someone asks a question, gotcha. Okay, right. I was just answering a question on what's the background of the lost orders and what's my take on them. Thanks, Claudette, for telling me I didn't know. Are there other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
It seems from what you're saying that there are two key things that have changed these few and subsequent actions. And I'm just checking to see what. Right.
Yeah.
One, that Harper's-Ferry Garrison doesn't surrender. And two, that Federals get to the Submountain Gas more quickly and with more force, and therefore the larger battle on September 14th.
Yep.
So those two things kind of screw up the whole plan. Is that a fair?
Yeah, that's a fair conclusion. And you know what the ironic thing about it is, and I'm sorry, here's the question again. The question that was just asked was taking from my comments that there were two factors which changed Lee's sort of calculus for the whole campaign. One of them being the Federal Army moving faster towards South Mountain than Lee had expected. And the other one being that Harper's Ferry didn't surrender as fast as Lee had hoped it would surrender. So there's plenty of evidence to suggest that Lee expected the garrison to surrender basically within 24 hours. He expected that once they found that they were surrounded on all sides, because remember, John Walker's division comes back through this area and goes up to Loudon Heights and seizes those heights too. So they're really sealed off. He expected that all to take place and to be done by, say, the 12th at the latest. And one of the reasons we know this is that Richard Anderson recalled in a letter after the war, and Anderson's commander of one of the divisions in Pleasant Valley with Lafayette McLaws. Anderson says that Lee called him to his tent on the 9th when all the orders were being distributed, did not give him a copy of the written orders, but told him verbally that Harper's Ferry must be taken by Thursday, which is the 11th, which is really even earlier. And he said Lee repeated it 3 times while he was there. So Lee wants this all to take place as quickly as possible. The problem is it's not under his control when Dixon Miles decides to surrender his garrison, right? So here's the irony of the whole thing. Miles told George McClellan, through a courier that actually made it through the lines and made it to McClellan on the morning of the 14th, he said, I can hold out for 48 hours. I have enough food to hold out for 48 hours if you can make it to me. So what does he do? He surrenders 24 hours later. So McClellan already has plans to punch through at Crampton's Gap and to relieve the garrison, and Miles surrenders too soon. So for Lee, it was too late. For McClellan, it was too early. So it's really kind of a strange situation there. But you're right. You got it. You understood the context is that Lee, in developing this plan against Harper's Ferry, or this complex plan to capture Harper's Ferry, commits himself to a time frame that he has no control over. And so when the schedule doesn't go to his plan, he's forced to wait and wait and wait, and he waits until the very last minute, and then all of a sudden he hears the gunfire and says, well, we have to go. And that's what that causes then the severe march of Longstreet's troops that ends up losing half of them on the side of the road, because they have to jog all the way back from Hagerstown to the mountain. And then, of course, once you get back to the mountain, you have to go up the mountain. So, and they're walking, where it's not like they have horses to carry these infantry. So, yeah, you're right. Were there any other questions? Is there anything online, Claudette? Did people ask online? No? Okay. Okay. Yeah, okay. Incidentally, in terms of local history, George Anderson's brigade passed through Lovettsville and was supposed to cross here to Brunswick. When they got down to the river's edge, they were fired on by men with the 87th Ohio who had cannon down there. And so he decided not to cross here and marched all the way back to Cheeks Ford, Nolan's Ferry area down there north of Leesburg, and crossed down there. But this was supposed to be a crossing point. So there was a brigade of Confederate troops that passed through here on September 5th in order to try and go down to pass over the river there. I thought it was a little local. On the Maryland side of the river. Yeah, they fired on, it was called Berlin at the time. Yeah. They fired on the Confederate troops that they saw over here because they could hear the band. The band was playing their Maryland, My Maryland, and so they threw a couple of shells at them and they skedaddled.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna ask you, since you changed the title, can you sing Maryland, Their Maryland?
No, I can't sing their Maryland, no. But there have been books written already that have My Maryland, Maryland, My Maryland as the title. So and also it's about their experience. And one of the things that if you don't mind me continuing a little bit, women played the pivotal role in determining what Confederate troops thought about Maryland. You can tell us from all of the comments they make about the way that the women treat them. They're either waving their handkerchiefs and, saying hurrahing for Jeff Davis, or they're, going off Fungu and, they're doing that. They're doing that kind of thing. And holding their noses, because the rebel army, you could smell it before you could see it. It was that bad. And so the rebel troops would walk past and women would do this. But they often, it's something that I don't think has been captured in really any other history of the Maryland campaign, just how important the role of women was in determining the quality of the experience that they had. And with that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you.